Hello and happy Monday. Today, we're going to switch things up a little bit and we're going to go through a few of the passages from the book and bring a little bit more light to them, okay? So let's start by getting the book up here. Now let's start with page 3 and discussing Mr. Liedesdorf. In 1844, Liedesdorf, then Mexican California's most prominent resident, was granted citizenship by the Mexican government. In return for his allegiance, Mexico gave him more than 3,500 acres of undeveloped land. His acquisition made him the largest landowner in the area. Great move, especially for a Black man during that time in the United States, right? But let's fast forward to how he repaid that favor. Okay, let's go right into that. In 1846, when Mexico went to war with the United States, Liedesdorf switched his allegiance to the Americans and was appointed United States Vice Consul to Mexico. After the Mexican-American War ended and the U.S. annexed California, the U.S. government made Liedesdorf the treasurer of the territory. In 1847, he built California's first public school and a horse racing track for the citizens' entertainment. When people question individuals like Vivek Ramaswamy, Clarence Thomas, things like that, like, how could you have such an allegiance? Wanting the adjacency to whiteness, because since Black people and brown people were brought to this country and then allowed to immigrate to this country, everything has been centered around whiteness being the goal to obtain. So even though your brown cousins are helping you out, when the country that forced you to be here, you still feel more allegiance to those that will pretend to place you at the table. When I say it's important to learn history, I'm not just speaking to one demographic. We are all bound to continue down this Groundhog Day rabbit hole until we learn where we have been so we can finally map out where we are going. Now, let's see. Okay, here we are. Now let's move to page 11, discussing when Frederick Douglass was speaking in Nantucket. His voice trembled as he spoke of being born and raised on a slave plantation in Maryland. He stuttered as he described enduring back-breaking labor and brutality at the hands of overseers. The audience hung on his every word. One of the attendees recalled, "Flinty hearts were pierced and cold ones melted by his eloquence. Our best pleaders for the slave held their breath for fear of interrupting him." Translation, he was one of the good Negroes, so we paid attention to what he had to say because we already knew the atrocities of slavery because we were participating in it or witnessing it and turning it a blind eye to it because, our skin folk. When Douglass finished, the well-known abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, a slim man with thinning hair, leaped onto center stage. He praised Douglass and sermonized on the evils of slavery, whipping the crowd into a fury. Have we been listening to a thing, a piece of property, or a man? He demanded, motioning forward towards Douglas. But let us not forget, and last week and the week before last, William Lloyd Garrison wasn't really a religious man. William Lloyd Garrison really wasn't a preacher. See, a lot of these abolitionists put on a show. They weren't just touring exceptional Black people around Europe to say, "Ooh, look what we did with our Black folk." They were using, let me repeat that, they were using Black bodies, Black labor, Black experience to simply get good standing in the footnotes of history. That's why everything was moving through the church. And all of a sudden, in everybody's history for a period of time, they were a pastor, a minister, an evangelist. But when you scratch past the surface of their life, they were a heathen. They went to church for the event. They went to get the awards and the accolades as they put other bodies in harm's way for their credit. Now moving on to page 15, discussing Mary Pleasant making her way to Nantucket. When Pleasant arrived on Nantucket, she was put into the care of Mary Hussey, an elderly Quaker woman who dressed in bonnets and long skirts. "Call me Grandma Hussey," she told Pleasant. Grandma Hussey ran a store in a wood building located beneath a grassy hill by the town's pier, a stone's throw away from the Athenaeum. From the windows, one could see sailors and merchants working away on ships and moving about drums of whale oil. After Williams left Pleasant in the Hussey's care, Grandma Hussey decided not to send Pleasant to school and instead made her work in her store. My father, as I afterward learned, sent money every year for my education, but as I was an unusually smart girl and quick at everything, they kept me at work in the store. No, darling, they enslaved you by another name and profited off of you twofold, by the money that your father sent and the money you made for them in the store. But as a sense of survival, and we see it even now today, non-white people will make themselves comfortable within a fantasy regarding their oppression. That's how you can run into people who, when they tell their life story, you realize every step of the way has been racism, has been oppression, has been distraction, has been deterrence. But they see it as, well, I possess this characteristic, so they pushed me through. They never pushed you through, they held you back. They put you in the bucket with their mediocre kin, and that kin kept pulling you down and using your shoulders to call up, on, and out, until finally you were left singularly in that bucket, until they started convincing you to say unto your skin folk that if you work harder, longer, stronger, you'll just make it. Because it's easier than saying that the people who pretended to take me in out of the goodness of their own heart, especially under the guise of Christianity, did me wrong. And I wanted to point this out because so much of history, people just blanketly say the Quakers were anti-racism, they were pro-abolition, they were for the marginalized people. No, honey. No, honey. Not all of them. There is not A single category of human that you can say all of anything about. Hmm. But still on page 15, let's continue on with her journey, because as she's made herself comfortable in her fantasy, reality does still slip in. It does still slip in. Pleasant resented being kept out of school, but it was an early lesson about power dynamics in the antebellum era. I envy children who can write a good hand and spell correctly, and blame the hussies for not giving me an education. She later said, the hussies were rich and white, and although Pleasant was privileged to have been born free, the color of her skin and her gender still allowed her to be taken advantage of. Thus, she came to better understand the world she lived in. Either she could fight against those who had power, or she could work with them and accept the limitations that race and gender imposed upon her. She decided to do both. But here's the thing: can you truly work with someone who does not fully see you as an equal and who does not fully see you as human? And that intersectionality and that nuance that comes along with being a Black woman is deep and intense, because too many men are raised to believe that they have ownership and property over your body, and too many white people are raised to believe that they have ownership and property over your body, your labor, and everything else. So, who truly can you work with in a situation like this? And then put on top of it, keep in mind, she is a minor who was told by her father that these were friends of his. Well, really, they were merely customers of him, because her father, you remember from week 1, was a traveling salesman. And this should also give you a better understanding why so many men at the time, during the Reconstruction era, if they were of biracial heritage or multiracial heritage, and phenotypically Black or ambiguous, would just tell people they were Cuban, because it was exotic enough to be interesting, but white enough to be accepted as pseudo equal. They could do business and they could navigate the world differently than just being Black. See, the United States' obsession with exoticism for certain mixtures of ethnicities is very long standing. But even still, as census come and go, so do the parameters of whiteness. Let us not forget it was just a few years ago that the United States government looked at the Asian community and said, you know, if you want to put on this census that you're white, we won't object. Actually, we encourage it. Because statistically, their numbers are dwindling, and we know that white people, especially those that hold strong to white supremacy, love being able to skew statistics so that they can toss them in the faces of people that they believe should be beneath them. Because that's the only way they truly look good, and the only way they can rise, that they can be the creme de la creme. Let's go on to page 17. The inhabitants of Newtown were made up of Black whalers, escaped slaves, and domestic servants. They were led by the town's most prominent citizen, Absalom Boston. Absalom was a well-muscled man with a beard that stretched from his ears down his entire jaw, with no mustache. He wore gold hoop earrings, and his hair was coarse and pushed back into a pompadour. Absalom was Black royalty in Nantucket. He was a descendant of the island's Indian natives and Black slaves. His family was credited with having ended slavery on the island after his uncle, Prince Boston, had challenged the legality of slavery in Nantucket, sued for his freedom, and won. Now, I wanted to pull this out because a lot of times when we get into the, oh, it's just hair, it's not cultural, or culture is to be shared conversation, a lot of hairstyles that, or a lot of clothing or rituals or traditions that were a part of occupations some way, somehow, we know how, we know the way, have gotten turned into a subculture or culture themselves. And like I say all the time, that is like 100 years from now, people claiming plumbers or mechanics as their culture, then putting on overalls and spreading grease on their face as a part of their culture. But you hear how this whaler dressed. It wasn't just white people out on the ships. It wasn't just white people captaining ships. It wasn't just white people with pompadours, with gold hoop earrings. And isn't it funny how different fashion trends over different eras are deemed appropriate, inappropriate, scandalous, not scandalous, highbrow, lowbrow? They've gone through every course of every type of social class and part of society. And yet there's always somebody to their nose up at it. And Absalom's family was a prime example of white people opening up the judicial system to Black people on paper only, because not educating someone, not teaching them how to read and write, you're like, oh, they'll never find out about it. But if later on in history it's questioned, our descendants can say, well, they put it on the books that they could sue themselves out of there. They put it on the books that they could be baptized out of slavery. Well, they put it on the books. They put it on the books so that it is covered what they didn't put on the books: the ability for the enslaved to read the books, the ability for the enslaved or previously enslaved to testify in court regarding the books. That the previously enslaved couldn't serve on the juries to judge upon the books, could not sit on the bench to judge on the books. See the little technicalities and nuances that are already pre-thought for the long haul. This is why we say when they set forth these systems of racism and oppression in the United States, it was meant to be just as it is now, long-standing, and the foundation is just to be upkept and spackled for it to continue to work. They were already looking ahead. They already knew that at some point somebody was going to look behind. These are people who left other countries because they couldn't do things their way, and they didn't like the rules over there. And they knew what they were already verbally telling people. So they knew that how they treated Black folk, brown folk, indigenous folk in the United States would be retold. There may be a chance that these Black folks go to another country and tell those folks what we're doing. So we got to make it look good, but we got to make it look good for the long haul. Now let's skip on over to page 29 and let's discuss Emmeline. Emmeline was born on a tobacco plantation outside Norfolk, Virginia. Her exact birthday was never recorded, but she was told she had been born about the year 1815. Her mother was an enslaved woman named Lucy. When Lucy was first sold as a girl on a slave auction block in Virginia, the slave seller claimed she was a tribal princess who had been taken from the island of Hispaniola. The rumor of royal blood would become the family lure. Whether or not it was true, Lucy and her descendants would always believe they were from royalty despite their station as chattel. I've heard this lore regarding a lot of slaves, and it seems like it was more fiction in order to draw up price and value, and not just price for resale value or the sale of descendants. But keep in mind that slaves could be insured. Slaves could be used as collateral. So people were using the Trump tactics before we knew about Donald John Trump. For the first years of her life, Emmeline lived with her mother on a plantation in Lynchburg, Virginia, owned by a doctor named Philip Burton. When she was a small girl, Dr. Burton gave her as a gift to his youngest daughter, Rosalie Virginia Burton. A few years later, the Burton family sold off her mother, Lucy, to a planter in Natchez, Mississippi, along with 99 other slaves for more than $85,000. Today, worth $1.7 million. Emmeline's mother was sold away so early in life that Emmeline couldn't remember much about her. Rosalie, her owner, was the closest thing she had to family for most of her life. Emmeline and Rosa were more the order of sisters than mistress and maid, the family that owned her claimed. I despise this narrative of we were like sisters, that was like my brother, that was my best friend, because who owns their family and friends? Who does that? Now, we know that white people have a long-standing history of holding money and stature over their kinfolk in order to have control, to have that perfect Stepford picture going. But you sold off my mother so young in my life that I have no real memories with her, that I have added trauma due to separation, where I could not nourish from her bosom, where her bosom was producing nourishment for me, but another can find nourishment. Another can learn from her wisdom, just to turn around and disrespect her and sell her for the next profit down the river. See, that cozy, lovely history that they love to sell you in school isn't so cozy and lovely when you really break it down and pay attention to what the words mean. When you really put together everything that was going on at the same time. Because when there's an argument of, well, it wasn't all white people that had slaves, just the rich people. Darling, no system exists without compliance. That means that overwhelmingly there was compliance. Let me say it again. Overwhelmingly, there was compliance. And Rosalie was such a sister to her that Rosalie rented her out to a steamboat captain for his pleasure upon his